Hello and welcome to my channel. As promised, we are going to be building a website today from scratch with Netlify. I'm going to be doing my brother's law portfolio, and if you're new here, please hit that like button and subscribe. So in this mini-series, we're going to be covering how to set up the code base, coding for desktop, making it responsive so that you can code it down to mobile. We're going to be looking at how to set up forms in Netlify, how to add Google Analytics, and how to optimize for SEO. But in part one, we are going to code for desktop, make sure that our foundation is good to go, and make sure that Netlify is set up properly. So I honestly cannot give enough praise for Netlify. This is the only CMS that I've actually enjoyed using. But if we head over here, you can see those are my two sites that I have. You can buy domains through Netlify, which I've already done for Michael. But if we were to do that again, it's really easy. You just type in your domain name, verify if it's available, and if it is, you can buy it through Netlify. Yeah, only $12, that's not too bad, and they never sell your information. Cough, cough, Bluehost looking at you. But if you go into that site, you can actually drag and drop your files, and that's exactly what we're going to do once we've coded them all up. So for this project, I'm going to be using Dreamweaver. You can use whatever code editor you like. I'm just using this one because it automatically compiles Sass and makes it really easy. So here you can see me creating a new folder under my code files folder. That way all of my files will be in one place, and when I do need to go edit the folder and add images, it will be really easy to find. Now I'm going to add a couple of standard code pages. I'm going to add a home.html file, and I'm also going to add a home.scss file. And you can see as soon as I created that, Dreamweaver automatically created the home.css file, which is what I will link to my HTML document to be able to use that styling. And since I'm using Sass, I have the luxury of being able to create variables and mixins. So what you see me doing here is going back to the design, pulling the hex codes for different colors and setting them up as variables on the other end. Typically, I like to name these by function and not by color, because if I use the variable light turquoise for the background color, if Michael came back to me and said, hey, you know what, I want something a little bit more tidied up, can we use beige? Then that variable wouldn't make sense anymore. Now that I've set up all of my variables, I'm going to set up mixins, and what mixins are just reusable bits of code that you can use throughout your project. So anything that you find yourself typing in CSS over and over and over again is usually a good candidate for mixins. A shining example is the box shadow. I can never remember the syntax for box shadow, so I just have to do it one time, and then every time I have a box, I just include that, and it's good to go. So after I finish setting up my first mixin for the default type, I'm going to set up some base styling. I'm going to start with all of my H1 and text tags. I'm sure I will add more as I go along, but that's a really good base to start with. So as I'm adding my headings in here, I am doing the @include and then the Michael type mixin. That way I do not have to retype all of the text. So all I have to include here is the font size, and then since it's CSS cascading style sheets, even though I've already set a default font weight, I can go in and adjust those as needed. So if you did not watch the first part in this episode, which is designing the website, this is a tool called Figma. While the coding tab isn't perfect, it's really cool for things like box shadows. Since I already designed that, it actually translates it into code that I can copy and paste into this to make sure that it looks one-to-one. The next mixin that I'm going to create is the default button mixin. That way that every time I create a button, it always looks consistent. One thing I want to point out, since we will be using both in this project, is that anchor tags or A tags link to something, button tags perform a function. So in our navigation, we will be using anchor tags, but in our form, we will be using a button tag. Even though we can style them the same, they will actually perform differently. So the last thing I'm going to do in CSS for now is actually style the HTML tag. You can use the scroll behavior smooth and it gives you a really smooth experience. Not a lot of people know about that, and that's a really cool function. And you might have noticed we haven't actually done any real HTML yet. We've just attached our styling to it, so now that's what we are going to do. So I'm going to map out on my design how this is actually going to work. We are going to be using Flexbox, and in order to get it the way we want it, we are going to have to use a couple of tricks. So while we're going to have one big nav for the entire navigation bar, we're going to need to put a div around all of those items at the left and then another div around the phone number at the right so that I can group them and space them the way they need to be. So every time you set up Flexbox, you're going to need a few things. Display flex so the browser knows how to treat that, which direction you want it to go. You can do row, you can do column, you can change it once it gets to mobile, you can align items in the middle, you can align them at the start, and there's a lot you can do just with Flexbox. So at this point I've realized that I have not exported any of my images, so I'm going and doing that. I'm going to go into the folder that Dreamweaver created for me, create a content folder, and then export all of my images to that folder. And once we're done with that, we should see that populate on Dreamweaver on the other side. And ta-da! After all of our setup, we finally have something to show for ourselves. And as I'm going through, I'm just putting some dummy links in there to tell myself that I need to go in and add those later. I'm going to need to add a little bit of padding around each of those navigation items. And now you can see me creating another div specifically for that button on the right-hand side. And as soon as I start adding in the number, you can see that my Flexbox is working, but it still needs a little bit of styling help. So now you'll see me going back into my CSS file and creating my first nested class called call button. I'm calling the original styling from my first mixin default button. Now Dreamweaver has a live preview that you can see at the top, but it's a little bit hard to work with as you're trying to code, so I will typically open this up in another Chrome window and then debug from there. So here you can see me adjusting the padding for each of the elements. This is just a little bit easier for me since I am so visual, but you can skip this step entirely if you want. Then I take the values that I've used on that side and then go in and add them to my styling sheet. So I've noticed that my button hover looks a little bit choppy, so I'm going in and adding the cool and hover effect that is available in Sass and adding a transition duration and a transition timing function. And a note on that is that you always want to add it to your base button styling, or else it only gets called when you hover and then it won't actually pull in the transitions that you need. So now that our nav bar looks pretty good, I'm going to be going in and adding this image in the background and then adding the headings on top. So to start this, I'm going to create a new div with the class of About Michael, and then we're going to adjust our heading fonts and then add the image in the background. So I actually do not even need to use Flexbox for this section because I'm really only worrying about the text and the button on the left-hand side, and the image is going to act independently of the text. And since there is only one image in this div, I can actually just style the image tag as a whole. I'm going to give it an absolute value so that I can set exactly where it needs to show up. And as you'll see almost immediately, as soon as I add the image, it is showing over the text and not under it. And to fix this, we use something called the z-index. So on a 2D plane, you have the x-axis and you have the y-axis, but on a 3D plane, we have the z-index. So if we set our z-index to be -1, that should solve this problem. And typically, as a best practice, you only want to use a z-index of 1 or a z-index of -1. If you find yourself using a z-index of -999, usually that means that there's a better solution to that problem. Now I'm just going in and tweaking my text a little by adding in some line height and a couple of other adjustments. And now that I've reached this point on the page, I am going to copy my default button mixin and then turn it into an accent button. And now that everything's looking good, I'm going to be moving down the page to the areas of practice section. And keep in mind, we are just coding for desktop right now. Once I'm done with the page, I will double back and code for mobile. You can do this a lot of different ways. Some people code mobile to desktop, but this is just the way that I prefer to do it. So the first thing that I'm doing is I am exporting that wood texture to make sure that I can use that in my background. Setting up background images can be a little bit tedious because you will have to override some of the default qualities from the browser. So you always want to make sure to set your background size, set your background position, and set your image to not repeat. And now as I'm coding out his boxes, I'm including my box mixin to make sure that they look all the same. And I'm going to speed up for a second here while I figure out the spacing and margins. And since I want all of my boxes to look identical, I'm going to need to create a flex container with 3 objects underneath. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in my little icon and then style that line right below. And you'll see me add in the HR tag, which stands for horizontal rule. And as I've added in my heading and paragraph styling, it's starting to look like a real info box. All we need is a little bit of padding and we're good to go. As we're wrapping up the end of part 1, I just wanted to say thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next episode where I show you how to use Netlify forms.